when you study Aikido, that sort of really has a complement for learning how to be centered mentally, physically, psychologically, as well as understanding the circles of how to take someone's balance with very little strength and more of leading their energy.
Hey guys, in part one of my interview with Sensei Elliot Freeman, who is Steven Seagal's most senior student in Aikido. So he's a badass in Aikido, we know that. But in this first part, we're going to find out more about his background in martial arts history before he even got into Aikido. Of course, make sure to stay until the end of the video because we'll find out how Elliot Freeman actually got involved with Steven Seagal in the first place.
Sensei Elliot, we want to know how you became Steven Seagal's most senior student, but just to start, before you even got into Aikido, let's get a little bit of your martial arts history because it's a lot more diverse than just Aikido.
Well, there's this young child at the age, no, I mean, beat me up. I think my earliest formal martial arts training, and I've always been surrounded by people growing up who were in the martial arts, very special people that I've noticed were quite different. Mm-hmm. And there's something that when you see a person that has more than you can imagine, that you sort of are attracted to what makes them that way.
For sure.
So when I was about 14, early 14, I started, I was teaching, believe it or not, I was teaching pottery at a youth center in Miami Beach. And that's where I grew up. And one of the parents, one of the mothers said, why don't you join the Mudaquan class? And there was a quite substantially sized class going on there by Master James Diaz. Okay. Jimmy Diaz was like the personification of, you know, the Renaissance artist. He was a painter under Hans Hofmann. He used to do yoga, a yoga master. He played piano. He played all sorts of jazz instruments coming out of that era. And he was from South America, but more so he was a Mudaquan master instructor.
Question, Elliot, so you were doing pottery. Is there like a reason why this other parent said, do Taekwondo, because it's more manly, or was there some other reason?
I was a young, I was very lucky to have some good teachers in the arts at an early age. And I was making statewide competitions that I was actually winning as a very young man.
In pottery?
In pottery.
I didn't know they had pottery competitions. That's interesting.
Well, yeah, actually in art, state art classes for students, scholastic. And then I started to go into competition for different art shows that were in Miami Beach and South Florida, and then eventually the state.
Oh, cool.
And I was winning, and that's eventually where I went on to college to study art.
Nice.
So I really liked the idea of, especially on a potter's wheel, it was sort of like a centering sort of thing. And when you study Aikido, that sort of really has a complement for learning how to be centered mentally, physically, psychologically, as well as understanding the circles of how to take someone's balance with very little strength and more of leading their energy and moving.
Interesting.
So in high school, I was just enamored by Mr. Diaz, our instructor, and we even gathered up enough money to bring him to New York to get his next level ranking.
Oh,
and
wow.
Every summer in high school, I was in New York City studying with Master Richard Chun. So again, one of the first times I've been with, you know, great masters, and you're in cities and you're visiting other dojos and dojangs and you're seeing other martial arts. And as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid in high school, this is like New York City.
Yeah, that's cool.
So amazing way of really seeing the world. You see everything in New York. At the age of 15, I was already teaching with Master Chun's view. And we were talking earlier, we didn't train like once every Wednesday for an hour.
Sure.
We were Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, and we would see Mr. Diaz out there meditating, and he did yoga, and then he would meditate for an hour. And somehow, right on the dot, he would be eyes open. The flies would disappear from his face, that he didn't wiggle around. I mean, it was almost magical.
Wow.
And we would do 4 hours of training, no water, no breaks. We were kicking coconut trees, literally. And
We got to get those coconuts down, then you get your water.
one way. So we had incredibly rigorous training where we would train very often during the week, not in one class, but 2 or 3 sometimes. I found a teacher that was teaching us staff nunchucks way before Bruce Lee's famous
Sure. Before he
movies.
popularized it, yeah.
And Rick Hamilton was Chuck Norris's first black belt, and he was in a show at the Fontainebleau Hotel for about an hour, for about a year and a half. So Rick Hamilton taught us sparring techniques that were more worldwide rather than specifically Mudokwan. So we started to get sort of a mixed martial arts perspective. And I got this thing called a driver's license at the age of 16. And on my birthday, March 30th, I took off with a friend to see this guy that we heard about in Fort Lauderdale. And this was before I-95 was built.
Okay.
And so there was a hard way to get there. It wasn't a short path. And on my birthday, we went and saw this guy that supposedly could throw people without touching them. Had to see that. And I had my driver's license to do it.
Sure.
You know? So maybe, maybe not. But those days I was very young and very naive in the martial arts and willing to learn and willing to put in the time.
For sure.
And as long as the surf wasn't up, that we weren't going surfing, I was in a martial arts class after school. And that's just kind of how we grew up.
Yeah, training 4 hours a day. So basically 1 year of training would be like the equivalent of like multiple years for most people that go like an hour, a couple of days a week in their whatever shopping center. So.
We need to get our iPhones out and figure that out, you know,
Yeah,
the hours.
yeah. So you were teaching at high school basically.
We had in our high school the most amount of martial arts that were taught to a very large high school, obviously in Miami Beach. And we had more martial arts going on there and people practicing martial arts than even in Hawaii. It was the most practicing high school of martial arts. So when we had our days when, you know, the high school might have had a lockdown because of riots and whatnot, we had a very dangerous group of people. That was, it was quite interesting.
Yeah, like the movie Only the Strong, because that took place in Florida. The question is, was martial arts in high school popular in general in Florida, or was your high school kind of like an outlier? Because
it was really popular throughout South Florida. There were
Really?
some really great champions there that still are there. Cisco, Herbie Thompson, these are like patriarchs in the black community. And then we had Nisi Gojuru, we had the USKA with Ruiz, Master Triez. We had some of the greats in South Florida, and we had some of the biggest competitions in South Florida at that time. So we all did open tournament sparring.
okay,
And then we sort of, I sort of was very interested always in the potential of the classical Aikido. And that's kind of a conversation in and of itself, isn't it?
so age 16, you start training in Aikido.
I started training with a gentleman, Jim Walsh, that spent a great deal of time in Japan. His family was very connected, I believe, with the government, and he's still working with the government and some other crazy stuff.
Now, were you focusing more on that at the time, or did you still kind of do a lot of the taekwondo?
No, I think it
or-
was a plethora of things going on. We had one of our highest ranking people, and he's 8th Dan now under Richard Chun. Richard Chun, Master Chun, just passed away and left Bill Santiago as an 8th Dan in Miami Beach, or Miami now area. And he started doing Kendo and Iaido. So when we started doing kendo and Aikido with the armor and getting the bamboo swords, and I, of course, remember talking my father into taking me down to the Miami River, and I found a place that had barrels of Japanese swords. So
Really?
this is the end result of a lifetime of collecting. Maybe not the end result, but you know, I got my first Japanese sword when I started doing kendo and Aikido and learning how to draw a blade. And at a very young age, I got exposed to a lot of people who were experts. They were just really skilled martial artists, very dedicated, and not commercial. I mean, we didn't even understand what commercial martial arts was. My teacher was poor as a church mouse, and we had to get money up for him to go to New York to get his next rank, and we were fully on board with that. You know, he was our responsibility. In high school, I had my own school in what it was like 3 evenings, and then I would still go to all these other classes, and they sort of filled it out.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So you basically started teaching other high school kids while you were in high school, while you were still continuing to advance.
Well, and it
your
was
own
a
learning.
continuing adult education, so not only were there high school kids, there were junior high school kids, but the majority of my people were actually people out in the world with a job, which, you know, to me didn't seem odd, because you don't ask people their politics and their, you know, what they're doing in life. They're your students. And I remember when I went away to college, to undergraduate school, one of them was a lifeguard for the beach, and he was, you know, a high-ranking guy. And he looked at me and he said, "You're going to college? How old are you?" And he had no idea that for 3 years he'd been training with a guy who started at the age of, you know, I don't know, 15, 16 years old. And he was just blown away. But he was very skillful, so I had a great student.
For sure, that's awesome.
So in college and undergraduate school, I had a very nice program. But when I went to graduate school in Carbondale, I had an idea. And it was with Hollywood Tim Andreessen. We found out that we were both doing alternate guard. We were looking very carefully at Joe Louis's work.
Okay.
We would take Super 8 films and go back and forth to see, before we would burn the film and it would burn.
Yeah, sure.
And we would look at Bruce Lee's films, and we really recruited every single black belt that we could that came in. And as a graduate student, we had Steve Favis from Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. We had Takako Oshima, who was an Aikido black belt, and very, very traditional. Her father was one of the great calligraphers and kind of country calligrapher and poet in Japan. We had modern day open style tournament a la, in our field, it was mostly Joe Louis that influenced us, along with a lot of people who were looking at him as well during that time. The great Joe Louis was amazing. And we miss him. And we miss him. But we were teaching a plethora of really great martial arts, including Muay Thai. And we had 400 people training at SIU Carbondale.
Wow.
Every week we had 32 two-hour blocks of programs from around that we scheduled. So it was almost like, we were bigger than any department that was at that university.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So
what were you, well, obviously you're passionate about martial arts, you know, that you're a lifetime martial artist. When you were in high school and college, did you think that I'm going to run my own dojo and I'm going to teach the rest of my life? Was that a thought?
No, I think my teachers were much more, let it happen, let it unfold. And when I was in Chicago, I had lived in Montana, I had lived in Colorado for college, and Carbondale, Illinois. And I all of a sudden had an opportunity from one of the great patriarchs of martial arts in Chicago, Larry Tankson, Shihan Larry Tankson. It's like 15 gold rings from Black Belt Magazine for the year's competitor.
Wow.
And I'm a 6 dan under Shihan Tangson as well. So Larry just said, I had such a great time coming down to Carbondale and training with 400 people. He had a school right across the street from Second City in Chicago, and it was Belushi's old house. And he and a couple other partners transformed it, built a room for our Aikido. Nice. And that was the first commercial school that we ever really had. At that time, I was training with Akira Tohei, a great master instructor in Aikido, and Satome Sensei. But I always thought something was they didn't like my Aikido.
Why? Why not?
Well, because I wasn't an Aikido stylist. I was a martial artist, and I had sword work. And when they would pick up the sword, it wasn't necessarily what I knew to be the working man's sword. If you notice, a lot of the sword guards and the blades that I have, I love a great world-class sword. But there's some attractiveness to a working man's sword and a working man's Aikido. And I never saw it until my mother had a heart attack.
Okay.
And we're going to zoom up to 91. And I ran down to Miami area, South Florida. And for 3 days, I couldn't sleep. I was sick to my stomach. My mother's on the operating table, and God knows what tubes, and it's a very scary thing for that operation.
Time, sure.
And I noticed there was a Aikido school across the highway from the hospital. So I walked over there, took my uniform, and I met Sensei George Angulo. And he has a similar background, and he used to be a cop. He was a small little Cuban guy. And he grew up in the same neighborhood as me, so we had a lot in common.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And we never met each other, but he said, well, so you can't sleep and you want to train? I get it. You're more than welcome. But why don't you teach the first class? And I'm like, no, I just want to train and be exhausted and then go to sleep. And he said, and he insisted. And I taught the class. He said, that was amazing. Why don't you stay for the black belt class? And there were quite a few black belts. And he looked at me and said, attack me as hard as you can with whatever you want to.
Okay.
And I looked at him like, what? That's different than the Chicago training that I had.
Sure.
And all of a sudden I came at him with my real stuff, I would call it. Because the other stuff was sort of like theory to me, and I think I can explain it pretty well in a minute or two. But I came at him, and all of a sudden he does this suriage and takes me down, and my feet go up, my head goes down. I slapped out, and I pulled my feet up underneath me as quickly as I could. I remember my eyes were like this big. And I looked him right in the eye. Well, he's shorter than I am, so I looked him down here. And I said, how do you know Steven Seagal? And he looked at me and he smiled. He goes, oh, you kind of got that, did you? And those were the days that you had to pay for long distance phone calls.
Sure.
And we racked up huge calls. The billing was just insane. But we became very, very, very close friends. Like, he's my brother.
Nice.
And George, about less than a year later, calls me up and goes, there is about 7-8 schools coming up to Steven Seagal Sensei's house. I want to introduce you. At that point in time, I had already been back and forth with him. And then he introduced me to another senior student and another senior student. And these people, I just was overwhelmed. But I went to Mr. Seagal's house. And the night before, I was with, my students were all going to meet me up there. We were about 25 people. And we met Mr. Seagal in the only restaurant that was within 28 miles of his ranch.
Okay.
And we go in there, and my girlfriend is sort of yelling at me a little bit like, I say, look, when we meet him tomorrow, we need to be very traditional. Sure. And she goes, so you want me to call you Sensei, right? Is that what you're saying? And I'm like, Yeah, I just want to keep it very, very formal because I hear he's more formal than most Japanese. And I was, of course, you're meeting someone that is just off the scale.
Oh, sure.
And she said, "Not on your life." And I'm like, oh God, I'm just dying. So, of course, the waiter seats us in this restaurant, and the only other people in there happens to be the person that's sitting right to my back here. And as I'm trying to get into the table, of course, it's Sensei.
Yeah, sure.
It's Seagal Sensei. And I'm like, oh my, and he's, good evening, And I'm like, oh, jeez, like, yes, sir, very nice, nice to see you, sat down, and my girlfriend is like, well, you're not talking very much tonight. And I'm like, yeah, just try to be quiet and get the evening done, eat, and get out.
So were you kind of intimidated in a way because he was like such a high-level Aikido master, or because he's like a big movie star?